Hi, I'm Brian Ives, and you're listening to or watching How You Play Your Hand. I'm talking to people who've gone through difficult times, and they're telling me how they got through those times. Of course, not everything is so cut and dried. In some cases, my guests aren't getting over or getting through things, they're talking about how they move forward. Today, I'm talking to a friend and former colleague, Amanda Gold, and I believe she falls into the latter category. I should mention off the top that I'm not a doctor, a therapist, or a career counselor. I'm just talking to people here who may have stories that may help you or inspire you. So I first announced this podcast by posting about it to my social media accounts. And Amanda was one of the people who reached out and said she'd like to tell her story. Amanda, thank you so much for offering to talk to people about your story. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And I'm hoping that talking about having a miscarriage, which is what I'm going to talk about, is something that will show others that it is more common and we're all in this together. And it's something that I wish I had uh,
Yeah.
more like seen or had other people talk to me about.
Yeah. And like I told you before we started recording, I did some research. I found an article in the Washington Post, and I had no idea of the statistic that 1 in 5 pregnancies results in miscarriage. Like, that is really high. And that means that a lot of people have experienced it and have not been able to talk about it because people don't talk about it.
I mean, I know when it happened to me, I felt like almost abandoned by women. Like I felt like how could other women have not talked about this and now I'm going through this alone? Um like I guess I'll backtrack for a second. Like I had a miscarriage. It was my first pregnancy. Right after I got married, we were like so excited. Um, and I have always had some medical issues, so I had a fear that I talked in therapy about being able to get pregnant, but not being able to carry a pregnancy. Like it's a fear I already had. Um, I was also like I was in therapy at the time for getting over an eating disorder, and then I'm afraid about being pregnant and I get pregnant, everything's great. We see a heartbeat. And then one day I went to the bathroom and there was blood. And it was like every worst nightmare, every fear I had in my everything. And then we went to the hospital and it we saw a heartbeat there still. So I didn't miscarry like at the very beginning. I was at the hospital and the doctor, and this is where I'm like, this was more upsetting than the actual miscarrying. The doctor said there's still a heartbeat. Now there's only 5% chance you're actually going to miscarry. And I thought, of course, I'm not going to be the 5%. Like, I'm going to be able to keep I went home, I rested, and then I bled and I knew when it passed because that was not a normal amount of blood anymore. And I was in a lot of pain. And even like I even remember that night, like we decided not to go back to the ER that night. Because in my mind, if I had a baby, I'd have it the next morning. If I didn't have a baby, I'd still not have it the next morning. Like we ate like we had like Japanese noodles, like we sat at home and ate. And I just felt so numb through it all. And like I didn't have the energy to deal with it. And when we went the next morning, I had miscarried. There was no heartbeat anymore. And I went home and I was so angry. Like when I talked to my mom about it, she was like, "Yeah, this is really common." And I was like, "Why didn't anyone tell me how common this is?" Like, I'm like, "What is wrong where we have to suffer in silence about?" And it's like, it also, I lost my baby at the same time that I lost my grandmother. And we're allowed to talk about losing my grandmother, but I can't talk about losing, like, my grandma was like in her 90s. She had many grandkids. She's traveled the world and like she was old. She died. it's upsetting, but like the hope of my own child dying was like, that broke me apart. Like I I couldn't understand why I was allowed to talk about one loss and not the other. And one would make people uncomfortable. And like I even remember telling my mom when she was like, it makes people sad and uncomfortable. And I'm like, what's wrong with that? Why can't people be uncomfortable? Like maybe I would have been uncomfortable, but at least I would have not been uncomfortable alone. Like it was very upsetting. And I mean, I named my first kid Dylan. I still have the picture of like the sonogram up on our door. And like what sucks, what's hard, and I'm lucky, it's a lucky hard. I don't like every time I go to the doctor, like I had two kids since then. And through my pregnancy, they always ask you, like, how many pregnancies have you had? How many kids do you have? I have to kind of relive that. I've had three pregnancies, but two kids. Like, it's something that like, and it's medical knowledge. I have to share it with my doctor if I want appropriate care. But it's something that is brought up. It's kind of with me. Um, I've had three pregnancies and two kids, and it's it's a sucky thing, but it sucked more that I had to do it alone.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, when you say that you can't talk about it, I mean, what do you like? Obviously, you tried talking about it to people, and like they just sort of shut down. Is that sort of?
So I hate saying blanket statements, but I tend to find that most Israelis that I've talked about it with are okay with me talking about it. And I do find that most Americans that I've tried talking about it with feel uncomfortable.
I
So I don't know if it's a cultural thing or a sensitivity thing, but I do find that the Americans I know suffer alone. They are used to suffering alone. So it's not that uncommon to have something bad happen to you and you suffer alone.
I should
Um,
mention, I guess, that you and I sat next to each other and worked together in New York when you were in New York.
mhm.
You now live in Israel, so this happened when you were in Israel.
Yeah, I miscarried in Israel, but I mean, I it was still in a time that I felt more more like a bridge in between. Like I felt still quite American and still new Israeli. Most of my friends were American. Um, I mean, I still most of my friends still are American. You can't once you move to a new country, you just find each other. Um,
Oh, so
but
you're
yeah,
friends with a lot of expats in Israel.
exactly. Yeah. But we're different kinds. Like I do find like living in New York, I did have to kind of keep a smile on my face more often than living here. And this really was my biggest fear come to life was like I said, like the idea of just like I really thought I could be fertile, but carrying a pregnancy is a whole other thing. And I'm
Yeah.
really lucky that I am fertile. As weird as it sounds, I'm not talking about like cows. Like I know I can get pregnant, but carrying a pregnancy for 9 months, like it takes a million things have to go right for you to have birth a kid. It takes one thing to go wrong for you to miscarry. And that actually helped me feel better knowing that really any kid that comes out is like a miracle because
Yeah.
millions of things had to go correct. But it's just the one thing they have no control over. One thing goes wrong and your body says this is not viable. And learning to like retrust my body after that. Like I ended up getting pregnant with my oldest kid 2 months after miscarrying. Um, because we thought, well, we should just keep trying. We don't know. I could miscarry for the rest of my life. Like it's sad, but it is a real thing that like there are women who have many, many, many miscarriages, and like on top of IVF and on top of just regular tracking your cycle, and there's no right way to do it. You just gonna have to keep trying until you can't try anymore. And I was my first pregnancy, it was every day I woke up thinking, am I going to miscarry today? Like, is today the one thing that's going to go wrong? And in order to kind of like keep myself from going down a rabbit hole, like I didn't prepare any, like I didn't read any books. I didn't Google anything. Like I had an app on my phone that each week would tell me like a fact or two about what was happening that week. And that was the only information I let myself like absorb. Like this week, the intestines are growing, or this week there's an eyeball, like things like that.
Mm.
Uh, we did zero preparation for having a kid. Like you hear people like making their husbands read books, and I was like, please don't read anything. Please don't think about it. We're not going to buy anything. Like it was only to like the very end where like the if something happened, there's a greater chance that the fetus can survive outside the womb. Like there's like a tipping point
Right.
where like the baby can't survive, and then there's like statistically they can survive. And when we got to that point, that's when I like let myself kind of dream about the future of having a kid.
Right.
Um, yeah, it just it doesn't leave you. Like even my second pregnancy, like my third pregnancy, but my second child, um, I mean, less I woke up every day, but like when we were talking about when do we want to have another kid, I was like, let's try. For all we know, I'm going to have another miscarriage, and it's going to be a while.
Right.
I mean, I luckily or not luckily, I was pregnant 2 weeks later after we said we were going to try again, and like I am very lucky that I'm able to have kids and carry kids, but that loss does it never left me, and I do apply it to a kind of everything in my life,
Yeah.
like, and sometimes like how I got through my first pregnancy of just taking it week by week and not preparing for the future has helped me in different ways. Um, it's just sometimes like I don't know, Dylan. I even remember with my first kid, there was one time she was crying so hard. I could not figure out how to make it stop. I started praying to Dylan. I was like, Dylan, please, like, help a mama out. Like, some, like, I need, like, I could, like, it just he comes up in different ways. And
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, when you reached out to me on Facebook, it really made me even rethink like what I'm doing here because like when I announced this podcast, I sort of thought of it as like, oh, people who lost jobs during COVID, but then maybe got new ones or changed their careers or people who broke up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. And I was like, those are things that maybe you get over. Like I thought I'd never get over losing a job until I got a new one. But
right.
this is completely different. Like you do not get over grief, you carry it with you. That's how
Yeah.
I see it, I guess.
And it kind of wraps back around to like what we talked about before this part of our conversation, in that like pain is not something to escape. Like it's part of your life, and you can't kind of be high through pain. Like it's not something that I I've had so many emotions around having the losing my first kid. And I feel like I went through all the phases of grief, like, but I remember being just so angry. Like I like my pain really manifested in anger, and I was angry at other women. And
Yeah.
that's where, like, I was so angry that, I mean, it's misguided because it's not just women's faults. But I was angry that I was conditioned to suffer alone.
Yeah.
And I was angry that we allowed this to happen.
We as
And
a society.
we as a society, we as women, like I said, it was misguided at women at the very
Yeah.
beginning. Um, but I put on Facebook that I was angry. How could this happen so often? And I don't know anyone who had a miscarriage. And then I had like 200 responses of people who had miscarriages. And I'm like, where the hell were you 2 weeks ago? I was like, why am I learning this after the fact? Like, it made it made me feel better, but it also made me just angry that we are conditioned not to talk about things that happen.
Yeah.
And then I like went through a whole other phase of like we put a probe on Mars. Like, how do we not know why I miscarried? Like, everyone comes out of a woman. Like, how do we not know what's going on? Like,
Right, right. What was it? I mean, you sort of alluded earlier, like your American friends and your Israeli friends sort of treated it different. And, I mean, I don't know. I've never been to Israel, but I feel like, and we sort of were discussing this a bit before we started recording, that in Israel, there's like an acute awareness that bad things can happen at any time, that maybe you might be sheltered from in America.
bad things happening is not. I don't want to say it's not earth shattering because it is earth shattering, but I guess they're more used to still being able to stand while the earth is shattering.
Right,
Like, it's not all consuming when shit hits the fan. And I mean, this is obviously a loose statement because different situations will affect different people differently. Like, I, but I do find that I was encouraged to reach out for help more here. Like, I found actually it was all on Facebook. I found like a what is it called? Like a support groups. Like,
right,
I joined like pregnancy loss support groups, but they were all Israelis, all Israeli based. Um, I joined Pregnancy Matters and just to like learn more about how the system works here. Like, there did seem, I mean, mind you, I've never gone through a miscarriage in the States. I don't know exactly what support is out there. But I did find that when I reached out for help on a public forum like Facebook, I got Israeli responses. So that's like, as opposed to saying, that's so sad, I'm thinking about you, they were like, have you seen this Facebook group? Or do you want to talk to this friend of mine? Like, it did feel more like, I see you, let me help you with your problem, instead of, I see you, it happens.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing your story. I know it's probably not easy to talk about, and it should be talked about more. What?
Honestly, it's easy to talk about because it happened to me. I
Right.
find it easy because it's the real part of my life.
What did you learn about yourself through this?
Um, I learned that my fears are real, but they are not the definition of me. Um, like after miscarrying, I struggled. Like, I was still coming off of an eating disorder. Like, I had other struggles that were still going on that my fears kind of all played together. And having to remind myself every day that it's real. It's real. It happened. But this is not the definition of my person. This is not the definition of my life is not going to be like on my gravestone. They're not going to say Amanda Gold Lapidot had a miscarriage. Like, that's not the only thing that's going to happen to me. Or like Amanda Lapidot had an eating disorder. Like, these are not the things that are going to define everything. I mean, did it change me? And I learned that changing me is not always a bad thing. It gave me a lot of new knowledge, a lot of different perspectives. It showed me that this happens so often. Um, but I learned, yeah, I learned about myself that it's not, I don't have to define myself by the shit that happens to me.
Right. And I mean, I was going to say, what's your advice for other people? But it sounds like what you learned about yourself might also be your advice for others.
Yeah. And like, yeah, they're not writing on my gravestone, Amanda, she had all these shitty things that happened to her.
Yeah.
Like, it's it's unfortunate, but it is also fortunate. Like, I do think it shaped me as a person. I think I'm a better mother. I think I'm a better friend having a miscarriage. I definitely have reached out to more people because of it. Like, people I haven't talked to in years, when I hear they have a miscarriage, I've reconnected with people because we can share our grief and be honest about it. Like, I do think I'm a better friend, a better mother. I think I'm a better wife because I don't know. I also like, if I'm not going to talk about Dylan, no one's going to talk about him. Like, it is going to be as if he didn't exist. And for me, he existed. And like, one of the best things, like, the best comments that someone made to me about it was that no one can take away the 2 months. No one can, like, I was an Ema, I was a mother the whole time I was pregnant to that kid. And no one can take that away from me. So it's my first child. I just didn't get to hold him. I don't even know if it was really a male, but like, I had a dream about him. So I
I
named him
mean,
Dylan.
I think you could decide what he, I think
Yeah,
that's fine
it makes me feel good and it's not hurting anybody. So it's okay.
for sure. Well, Amanda, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your story. I learned a lot from preparing for this interview and speaking with you, and it is really important to normalize this. And, just thanks for sharing it. And thanks to all of you for watching or listening. And I will catch all of you next time on How You Play Your Hand. Hi. Amanda and I had this conversation back in December, but last week on Friday, after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, she reached out to me and asked if I could drop her episode and maybe replace it with something that was more relevant to this moment. Of course, I said no. Her story is relevant no matter what moment, it is. But during our conversation, she noted that in Israel, there's a term hafalah, which refers to both miscarriages and abortions. And it just struck me that the issue is so politicized here. So if this insane reversal of law bothers you, I'll just encourage you to donate to Planned Parenthood or the National Network of Abortion Funds or to your local clinics. And not to get even more political, but you might also want to donate to elected officials like congresspeople, senators, governors, and local leaders, especially in closely contested states and districts. Anyway, that's it for this week. I'll see you next week on the last episode of season 1 of How You Play Your Hand. Have a good week.